Long before Egypt became the cradle of civilization, there was another world, a world of advanced knowledge, divine wisdom, and unimaginable power. But that world did not survive. According to ancient texts, when this first civilization collapsed, one being did not fall with it. Thoth, the keeper of knowledge, carried the sacred wisdom of that lost age across time. This forgotten world was not built of sand and stone, but of harmony and balance. Its people aligned temples with the stars, carved symbols into spirals and circles, and treated silence as sacred. They believed themselves eternal, and in that belief they sowed the seeds of their own collapse. Pride grew louder than humility. Noise drowned silence, and wisdom was dismissed as superstition. Collapse followed, quietly, step by step, until floods and fires erased their monuments. Yet Thoth endured. He did not mourn the fall, for he knew cycles are inevitable. Civilizations rise, flourish, forget, and fall. What mattered was not the fall itself, but what fragments of wisdom could be preserved. And so Thoth gathered symbols, myths, and rituals, disguising them carefully so they could survive collapse. Spirals carried the memory of cycles, circles preserved balance, stars whispered humility, and animals became carriers of wisdom. But why did he choose Egypt? Why did he bring humanity's surviving knowledge to this specific land and not another? Egypt was not the only candidate. Mesopotamia offered fertile soil, the Indus whispered rivers, Anatolia carried highlands. Yet Egypt was different. Egypt was a land shaped by rhythm, the flood and retreat of the Nile, the silence of the desert, the eternal watch of the stars. It was a place where balance could be remembered, where silence could be honored, and where wisdom could be disguised in ritual. The Nile became the heartbeat of wisdom. Each year it rose and fell, flooding fields, nourishing soil, reminding humanity of cycles. The desert became the guardian of silence, vast and patient, preserving memory in stillness. The stars became eternal scribes, aligning temples, guiding rituals, disguising cosmic truths. Egypt was not eternal, but it was rhythmic, not invincible, but patient, not powerful, but silent. And so Egypt became the chosen vessel. Its Nile carried cycles, its desert preserved silence, and its stars whispered humility. Thoth planted wisdom there, disguised in myth, preserved in ritual, and encoded in symbol. Egypt became the land of rebirth, the last hope for human wisdom, the cradle of civilization after the fall. Stay with us, because what comes next may change how you see the origins of history forever. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, hopefully not from inside a pyramid, because internet reception in there is terrible. The world before Egypt was not a desert of silence, but a stage of grandeur. The first civilization rose with astonishing brilliance, temples aligned with constellations, rituals echoing cosmic rhythms, and knowledge so advanced that later ages would call it divine. Its people believed themselves eternal, and in that belief they sowed the seeds of their own undoing. At first, balance guided them. Farmers planted by the stars, priests honored silence, and healers used sound as medicine. Wisdom was not a possession, but a rhythm. Yet, as generations passed, pride crept in. Knowledge became vanity, rituals became spectacle, and silence was dismissed as weakness. The very tools of harmony were twisted into instruments of control. The collapse did not arrive suddenly. It came quietly, step by step, disguised as progress. Temples grew taller, but their purpose faded. Rituals grew louder, but their meaning was lost. Pride grew stronger, but humility diminished. The civilization believed itself invincible, mocking the warnings encoded in symbols, dismissing the whispers of silence, and silencing those who remembered. Nature responded. Floods rose, fires spread, winds howled, and monuments crumbled. What had been eternal was erased in a breath. The people scattered, their wisdom drowned, their rituals forgotten. The first civilization, once radiant with balance, vanished into myth. Yet one being did not fall with it. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, witnessed the collapse with patience. He did not mourn, for he knew cycles are inevitable. Civilizations rise, flourish, forget, and fall. What mattered was not the fall itself, but what fragments of wisdom could be preserved. And so, as the first civilization crumbled, Thoth gathered what could be saved. He carried symbols, myths, and rituals across time, disguising them so they could survive collapse. Spirals carried the memory of cycles, circles preserved balance, stars whispered humility, and animals became carriers of wisdom. The collapse of the first civilization was not the end, but the beginning of preservation. It was the moment when pride destroyed, silence preserved, and humility sustained. It was the moment when Thoth became the witness of the lost age, carrying fragments of wisdom into the future, waiting for a land where they could be planted anew. Egypt was not yet chosen, but the collapse made the choice necessary. The first civilization had fallen, but wisdom endured, hidden in silence, disguised in myth, preserved in symbol. The story of humanity would begin again, but only if Thoth found a vessel strong enough to carry fragments of truth across ages. When the first civilization collapsed, its monuments crumbled, its rituals faded, and its wisdom scattered like dust in the wind. Yet one figure remained, watching with patience that stretched beyond time itself. Thoth, the eternal scribe of the gods, did not fall with the world he had served. He became the witness of the lost age, carrying memory across silence, guarding fragments of truth that pride had destroyed. Thoth was not a ruler, nor a warrior, nor a builder of monuments. He was a keeper of records, a guardian of knowledge, a scribe who understood that wisdom must be preserved even when civilizations forget. While kings sought glory and armies sought conquest, Thoth sought endurance. He knew that pride blinds, silence preserves, and humility sustains. His task was not to save a civilization, but to save its wisdom. As temples collapsed and rituals turned to ash, Thoth gathered what could be carried. He disguised truths in symbols, encoded memory in myth, and preserved silence in ritual. Spirals became reminders of cycles, circles of balance, stars of humility. Animals carried fragments of wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, guided by humility. These were not decorations, but vessels of memory, waiting patiently for seekers to rediscover their meaning. Thoth's witness was not passive. He did not merely observe collapse. He preserved its lesson. He knew that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride grows louder, silence is lost, and collapse follows. His witness ensured that even when history began too late, fragments of truth would endure. The lost age was not erased entirely. Its monuments vanished, its rituals forgotten, but its wisdom survived in silence. Thoth carried it across time, waiting for a land where it could be planted anew. He did not choose quickly, for he knew the vessel must be patient, rhythmic, and silent. Egypt was not yet chosen, but Thoth's witness made the choice inevitable. And so Thoth became the eternal scribe, the guardian of memory, the witness of the lost age. His task was not to preserve power, but to preserve wisdom. His silence carried truth across centuries, waiting for humanity to listen once more. When the first civilization fell into silence, its monuments shattered and its rituals forgotten, one figure remained as the guardian of what could not be destroyed. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, became the keeper of sacred knowledge. His task was not to preserve armies or empires, but to safeguard wisdom itself, the essence of balance, silence, and humility that had sustained humanity before pride consumed it. Thoth understood that knowledge was fragile. Scrolls could burn, temples could crumble, and languages could vanish. Yet wisdom, when disguised in symbols and rituals, could endure. He carried fragments across time, encoding truths in spirals, circles, and stars. He entrusted animals with meaning, the ibis as a sign of clarity, the serpent as renewal, the lion as strength tempered by humility. These were not ornaments, but vessels, designed to survive, collapse, and whisper truths to future generations. As the keeper of sacred knowledge, Thoth did not seek worship or glory. He sought endurance. He knew that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. His guardianship ensured that even when history began too late, fragments of truth would remain, waiting for seekers with humility. Thoth's role was both patient and deliberate. He did not rush to plant wisdom in new lands. He wandered across silence, searching for a vessel strong enough to carry fragments of truth. He knew the choice must be careful, for only a land shaped by rhythm, silence, and humility could preserve wisdom across ages. Egypt was not yet chosen, but Thoth's guardianship made the choice inevitable. The sacred knowledge he carried was not a library of facts, but a rhythm of truths. It taught that silence preserves, humility sustains, and pride destroys. It reminded humanity that progress without balance is vanity, knowledge without wisdom is noise, and civilizations collapse when they forget these lessons. And so Thoth became the eternal keeper, guarding fragments of wisdom across centuries. His silence carried truths, his symbols disguised memory, and his patience ensured endurance. He was not the savior of a fallen world, but the guardian of what mattered most, the sacred knowledge that could guide humanity, if only it chose to listen. When the first civilization collapsed, not everything could be saved. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, carried fragments of wisdom across time, but much was lost forever. The monuments that once touched the sky crumbled into dust, their alignments with the stars erased by floods and fires. The rituals that once echoed cosmic rhythms faded into silence, their meaning forgotten as pride drowned humility. The languages that once carried sacred truths vanished, leaving only fragments carved into stone, indecipherable to later generations. What was lost forever was not simply stone or scrolls, but the living memory of balance. The people who had once honored silence dismissed it as weakness. The healers, who had once used sound as medicine, twisted it into control. The priests, who had once guarded wisdom, turned rituals into spectacle. When collapse came, these practices vanished, leaving only echoes in myth. Entire sciences disappeared. The knowledge of aligning temples with constellations, the art of encoding truths in sound, the rhythm of planting by celestial cycles, all dissolved into fragments. Later civilizations would rediscover pieces, but never the whole. Pride had erased what humility had preserved. Thoth knew he could not save everything. He watched as monuments fell, as rituals faded, as languages vanished. He understood that collapse is not punishment, but consequence. Civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. What was lost forever was the arrogance of eternity, the belief that humanity could defy cycles. Yet, even in loss, fragments endured. Symbols survived, spirals, circles, stars, animals, myths disguised truths, rituals carried echoes, silence preserved memory. What was lost forever was the completeness of wisdom, but what remained was enough to guide humanity, if it chose to listen. The fall of the first civilization was not total erasure, but a reminder. It showed that pride destroys, silence preserves, and humility sustains. What was lost forever was the arrogance of invincibility. What was saved was the lesson that civilizations rise and fall, but wisdom endures in fragments, waiting patiently for seekers to rediscover its meaning. Though the first civilization collapsed in silence and ruin, not everything was erased. Amid the floods, fires, and forgotten rituals, fragments of wisdom endured. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, became the guardian of what could be saved. He carried truths across time, disguising them in symbols, rituals, and myths so they could survive, collapse, and whisper their meaning to future generations. What was saved was not the monuments of pride, nor the languages of spectacle, nor the rituals twisted into control. What endured were the foundations of balance. Spirals preserved the memory of cycles, reminding humanity that civilizations rise and fall. Circles carried the truth of harmony, teaching that beginnings and endings are the same. Stars whispered humility, guiding seekers to look upward and remember their place in the cosmos. Animals became vessels of wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, tempered by humility. These fragments were not obvious. They were disguised carefully, hidden in silence, waiting for seekers with patience. Myths carried echoes of truth, rituals preserved shadows of wisdom, and silence guarded memory. What was saved was not a complete library of knowledge, but enough to guide humanity if it chose to listen. Thoth's preservation was deliberate. He knew that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. His guardianship ensured that even when history began too late, fragments of truth would remain. They would survive floods, fires, and forgetfulness, waiting patiently for rediscovery. What was saved became the seed of rebirth. Egypt would inherit these fragments, planting them in temples, rituals, and myths. The Nile would carry cycles, the desert would preserve silence, and the stars would whisper humility. Egypt would not be eternal, but it would be rhythmic, not invincible, but patient, not powerful, but silent. And so, what was saved was not monuments or armies, but wisdom disguised in silence. It was the rhythm of balance, the humility of stars, the patience of cycles. Thoth ensured that even when civilizations fall, fragments of truth endure, waiting for humanity to rediscover their meaning. When the first civilization collapsed, silence spread across the world. Its monuments lay in ruins, its rituals faded into dust, and its wisdom scattered like fragments of a broken mirror. Yet Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, did not remain among the ruins. He began a journey, a long, patient wandering across lands and ages, carrying fragments of sacred knowledge, searching for a place where they could be planted anew. This journey was not swift. Thoth moved through lands scarred by collapse, observing humanity as it struggled to rebuild. In Mesopotamia, he saw fertile soil and rivers that promised abundance, but he also saw pride rising too quickly, rulers eager for conquest, and rituals already turning into spectacle. In the Indus Valley, he found rivers rich with life, but silence was not honored there. Noise grew louder, and humility was dismissed. In Anatolia, he saw highlands strong and enduring, but the rhythm of cycles was forgotten, and balance was not preserved. Thoth carried wisdom carefully, disguising it in symbols and myths. Spirals reminded him of cycles, circles of balance, stars of humility. Animals became vessels of memory, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, guided by humility. These fragments were not heavy, but they were precious, for they carried the essence of what had been lost. The journey after the fall was not only across lands, but across silence. Thoth listened to humanity's struggles, its attempts to rebuild, its failures to remember. He knew that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. His journey was a search for a vessel strong enough to carry fragments of truth across ages. Egypt was not yet chosen, but the journey made the choice inevitable. The Nile's rhythm, the desert's silence, and the stars' eternal watch would become the guardians of wisdom. Thoth's wandering ensured that fragments of truth would not be lost, but carried patiently until the right land was found. And so, the journey after the fall was not a flight from ruin, but a pilgrimage of preservation. Thoth walked across silence, carrying fragments of wisdom, waiting for the land where humanity could begin again. After the collapse of the first civilization, the world was left in silence. Monuments lay in ruins, rituals faded into dust, and wisdom scattered like fragments of a broken mirror. Humanity wandered through confusion, struggling to rebuild, but without the balance that had once guided them. Pride had destroyed what humility sustained, and silence had been dismissed as weakness. The fall was not only the end of a civilization, but the loss of humanity's rhythm. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, watched patiently. He knew that collapse was not punishment, but consequence. Civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. Humanity, stripped of its foundations, needed a new beginning. Without it, the fragments of wisdom he carried would fade into myth, forgotten and ignored. The new beginning was not about rebuilding monuments or armies. It was about restoring balance. Humanity needed to remember that silence preserves, humility sustains, and pride destroys. They needed to rediscover the rhythm of cycles, the harmony of balance, and the humility of stars. Without these truths, progress would become vanity, knowledge would become noise, and collapse would return again and again. Humanity needed not just survival, but guidance. They needed a place where silence could be honored, where cycles could be remembered, and where wisdom could be disguised in ritual. Egypt would become that vessel, but the need for a new beginning came first. Humanity had to be reminded that collapse is not the end, but the opportunity to begin again. The fall of the first civilization was the death of pride, but the birth of preservation. And so, humanity needed a new beginning, not in power, but in silence, not in conquest, but in humility. After wandering across lands scarred by collapse, Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, faced the most important decision of his journey: where to plant the fragments of wisdom he had carried from the ruins of the first civilization. Mesopotamia had fertile soil, but its rulers were already consumed by conquest. The Indus Valley had rivers rich with life, but silence was not honored there. Anatolia had strong highlands, but the rhythm of cycles was forgotten. Each land offered promise, yet each carried the seeds of pride that had destroyed the first civilization. Egypt, however, was different. It was a land shaped by rhythm, silence, and humility. The Nile rose and fell with patient regularity, flooding fields, nourishing soil, and reminding humanity of cycles. The desert stretched endlessly, preserving memory in stillness, guarding wisdom in silence. The stars shone above, eternal scribes, aligning temples, guiding rituals, and whispering humility. Egypt was not eternal, but it was rhythmic, not invincible, but patient, not powerful, but silent. Thoth recognized that Egypt's geography was more than landscape. It was symbol. The Nile carried cycles, the desert preserved silence, and the stars whispered humility. These rhythms mirrored the truths he carried. Civilizations rise and fall, silence preserves, humility sustains, pride destroys. Egypt was not chosen for its armies or monuments, but for its patience and balance. The choice of Egypt was deliberate. Thoth knew that wisdom must be disguised in ritual, preserved in silence, and encoded in symbol. Egypt's rhythm made it the perfect vessel. Its people would build temples aligned with stars, perform rituals echoing silence, and carve myths that disguised truths. Even when pride returned, fragments of wisdom would endure, waiting patiently for rediscovery. By choosing Egypt, Thoth ensured that humanity's surviving knowledge would not vanish. Egypt became the land of rebirth, the cradle of civilization after the fall, the guardian of fragments that carried the essence of balance. The choice was not about power, but preservation, not about eternity, but rhythm, not about conquest, but silence. And so, Egypt was chosen not as the strongest, but as the most patient, not as the richest, but as the most rhythmic, not as the loudest, but as the most silent. Thoth planted wisdom there, ensuring that even when civilizations fall again, fragments of truth would endure. When Thoth finally chose Egypt, it was not for its armies or wealth, but for its rhythm. Egypt was a land where silence endured, where cycles repeated, and where wisdom could be disguised in ritual. It was not eternal, but it carried the patience of eternity. To Thoth, Egypt was more than geography. It was symbol, a vessel strong enough to preserve fragments of truth across ages. The Nile became the heartbeat of rebirth. Each year, it rose and fell, flooding fields, nourishing soil, and reminding humanity of cycles. Farmers depended on its rhythm, priests measured its flood, and scribes recorded its patterns. The Nile was not merely a river, but a living symbol of balance. It carried the memory of the first civilization, whispering that beginnings and endings are the same, that collapse is not punishment, but renewal. The desert became the guardian of silence. Vast, endless, patient, it preserved memory in stillness. Temples could crumble, scrolls could burn, but the desert endured. Its silence was sacred, shielding wisdom from noise, pride, and spectacle. To Thoth, the desert was the most faithful guardian, ensuring that fragments of truth would survive collapse, waiting patiently for seekers with humility. The stars became eternal scribes, temples aligned with Orion, pyramids mirrored constellations, and rituals echoed celestial rhythms. The heavens recorded truths across ages, reminding humanity of humility, guiding them to look upward and remember their place in the cosmos. The stars were not decoration, but memory, carrying fragments of wisdom across time. Egypt became the land of rebirth because it carried all three guardians: the Nile's cycles, the desert's silence, and the stars' humility. Together, they formed a vessel strong enough to preserve fragments of wisdom. Egypt was not chosen for power, but for patience, not for eternity, but for rhythm, not for conquest, but for silence. Egypt became the cradle of civilization after the fall, the land of rebirth, the guardian of fragments that carried the essence of balance. Even when pride returned, fragments of truth would endure, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Egypt was not chosen by Thoth simply for its rivers or deserts, but for the hidden geography that made it unlike any other land. Beneath its sands and along its valleys lay a natural design that mirrored the truths he carried from the first civilization. Egypt was not only a place of survival, it was a landscape of symbols, a geography that whispered wisdom to those who could listen. The Nile was the most obvious feature, but its rhythm was more than water. Each flood and retreat was a reminder of cycles, of beginnings and endings, of collapse and renewal. Its valley carved a path of fertility through silence, a living symbol of balance. To Thoth, the Nile was not just geography, but memory, a river that carried the essence of the first civilization's wisdom. The deserts, vast and endless, were guardians of silence. They stretched beyond sight, preserving memory in stillness. Temples could crumble, scrolls could burn, but the desert endured. Its silence was sacred, shielding wisdom from noise, pride, and spectacle. To Thoth, the desert was the most faithful guardian, ensuring that fragments of truth would survive collapse, waiting patiently for seekers with humility. The stars above Egypt were not merely decoration. They aligned with temples, mirrored pyramids, and guided rituals. The heavens became eternal scribes, recording truths across ages, reminding humanity of humility, and guiding them to look upward and remember their place in the cosmos. Egypt's geography was not only earth, but sky, a union of land and stars that carried wisdom across time. Even the hidden features of Egypt carried meaning. Its valleys preserved fertility, its oases offered renewal, its mountains guarded silence. Each feature was more than landscape. It was symbol, a vessel of wisdom disguised in geography. Egypt's land was not chosen for power, but for patience, not for eternity, but for rhythm, not for conquest, but for silence. Thoth recognized that Egypt's hidden geography mirrored the truths he carried: cycles, balance, silence, humility. By planting wisdom there, he ensured that even when civilizations fall again, fragments of truth would endure. Egypt became not only the cradle of civilization, but the guardian of memory, the land where geography itself whispered wisdom. Among all the features of Egypt, none carried more meaning than the Nile, to Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods. The river was not merely water flowing through desert sands. It was a living symbol of cycles, balance, and renewal. The Nile rose and fell with patient regularity, flooding fields, nourishing soil, and reminding humanity that collapse is not punishment, but rhythm, that endings are beginnings, and that silence preserves what pride destroys. Each year, the flood was both destruction and rebirth. Villages prepared for its rising waters, fields were submerged, and yet from that silence of inundation came fertility. Crops flourished, life returned, and balance was restored. The Nile taught humanity that loss is not final, but transformation. It whispered the same truth Thoth carried from the first civilization. Civilizations rise and fall, but wisdom endures in cycles. Priests measured the flood carefully, recording its rhythm, aligning rituals with its flow. Scribes carved calendars upon stone, marking the river's rise and retreat. Farmers planted by its cycles, trusting its silence to carry renewal. The Nile became more than geography. It became memory, a divine symbol of balance disguised in water. Thoth recognized that the Nile's rhythm mirrored the truths he preserved. Its flood was collapse, its retreat was silence, its fertility was rebirth. By planting wisdom along its banks, he ensured that humanity would always have a living reminder of cycles. Even when pride returned, the Nile would whisper humility, teaching that balance sustains and silence preserves. The river's path itself carried meaning. Flowing from distant lands into Egypt's heart, it united valleys, nourished deserts, and guided temples. Its journey mirrored Thoth's own, carrying fragments of wisdom across silence, searching for a vessel strong enough to preserve them. The Nile was not chosen by chance. It was chosen because it was symbol, guardian, and teacher. And so, the Nile became Egypt's divine symbol. It was the heartbeat of rebirth, the rhythm of balance, the whisper of humility. It carried the essence of the first civilization's wisdom, disguised in water, preserved in cycles, waiting patiently for humanity to listen. When the first civilization fell, its monuments crumbled and its rituals vanished, but fragments of wisdom endured. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, became the guardian of these fragments, carrying them across silence and centuries. Knowledge was not preserved in scrolls or libraries, for those could burn and be forgotten. Spirals carried the memory of cycles, reminding humanity that civilizations rise and fall. Circles preserved balance, teaching that beginnings and endings are the same. Stars whispered humility, guiding seekers to look upward and remember their place in the cosmos. Animals became carriers of wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, tempered by humility. But fragments of truth, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Myths told stories of gods and heroes, but beneath them lay echoes of wisdom. Rituals honored cycles, but beneath them lay reminders of balance. Egypt became the vessel of this knowledge. Its Nile carried cycles, its desert preserved silence, and its stars whispered humility. Temples aligned with constellations, rituals echoed cosmic rhythms, and myths disguised truths. Even when pride returned, fragments of wisdom survived, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Knowledge carried through time was not a complete library, but enough to guide humanity. It taught that silence preserves, humility sustains, and pride destroys. It reminded humanity that progress without balance is vanity, knowledge without wisdom is noise, and civilizations collapse when they forget these lessons. Knowledge carried through time became the seed of rebirth, planted in Egypt, preserved in silence, disguised in ritual. It was not the grandeur of monuments that endured, but the fragments of truth, waiting patiently for humanity to listen once more. The moment Thoth chose Egypt was not simply geography, it was destiny. Out of the silence left by the collapse of the first civilization, Egypt emerged as the vessel of rebirth. Its land was shaped by rhythm, its people guided by cycles, and its sky aligned with eternal truths. This was the birth of sacred Egypt, the cradle of wisdom after the fall. The Nile became the heartbeat of this new world. Each flood and retreat carried the rhythm of collapse and renewal, teaching humanity that endings are beginnings, that silence preserves, and that humility sustains. Farmers planted by its cycles, priests measured its waters, and scribes recorded its patterns. The Nile was not only a river, but a living symbol of balance, carrying fragments of wisdom disguised in water. The desert became the guardian of silence. Vast and endless, it preserved memory in stillness, shielding wisdom from noise and spectacle. Seekers entered its silence and returned with visions. Prophets found revelation in its stillness, and priests honored its patience. The desert was not emptiness, but memory, a sacred guardian ensuring that fragments of truth would endure collapse. The stars became eternal scribes, temples aligned with Orion, pyramids mirrored constellations, and rituals echoed celestial rhythms. The heavens recorded truths across ages, reminding humanity of humility and guiding them to look upward. Egypt's sky was not decoration, but scripture, carrying fragments of wisdom across time. Together, the Nile, the desert, and the stars formed the trinity of sacred Egypt. Egypt was not chosen for power, but for patience, not for eternity, but for cycles, not for conquest, but for silence. The birth of sacred Egypt was the rebirth of wisdom. Egypt became the land of rebirth, the cradle of civilization after the fall, the guardian of fragments that carried the essence of balance. Even when pride returned, sacred Egypt would endure, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover its meaning. When Egypt became the chosen vessel, Thoth did not begin with monuments of grandeur or armies of conquest. He began with temples, not as places of worship alone, but as vessels of wisdom. The first temples of Egypt were more than stone and ritual. They were libraries of silence, schools of balance, and mirrors of the cosmos. These temples were aligned with the stars, their walls carved with symbols, their rituals echoing cosmic rhythms. They were designed not to glorify rulers, but to preserve fragments of truth. Each pillar carried meaning, each chamber whispered lessons, each alignment mirrored the heavens. The temples were not built for eternity, but for rhythm. They were not monuments of pride, but guardians of wisdom. Within the first temples, silence was honored. Priests entered not to speak loudly, but to listen. Rituals were performed not as spectacle, but as remembrance. Myths were recited not as entertainment, but as disguise for truths. The temples became places where wisdom was preserved in ritual, disguised in symbol, and carried across time. The architecture itself was teaching. The rising columns mirrored the stars, reminding humanity of humility. The hidden chambers preserved silence, teaching patience. The carvings of animals carried fragments of wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, tempered by humility. The temples were not decoration, but instruction, guiding humanity to rediscover truths lost in collapse. Thoth's influence was clear. He ensured that the temples were not merely places of worship, but vessels of preservation. They carried fragments of the first civilization's wisdom, disguised carefully so they could survive collapse. Even when pride returned, the temples would endure, waiting patiently for seekers with humility. The first temples of wisdom were the foundation of sacred Egypt. They were not built to dominate, but to preserve, not to glorify rulers, but to honor silence, not to display power, but to carry fragments of truth. They became the guardians of wisdom, the schools of balance, the mirrors of the cosmos. And so, Egypt's first temples were more than stone. They were living vessels of wisdom, planted by Thoth, preserved in silence, disguised in ritual, and aligned with the stars, ensuring that fragments of truth would endure across ages. When the fragments of wisdom were planted in Egypt, Thoth did not withdraw into silence. He became a guide among early humans, shaping their understanding of balance, cycles, and humility. His role was not to rule, but to teach, not to command, but to preserve. Thoth's presence ensured that humanity's rebirth would not be built only on survival, but on wisdom disguised in ritual and symbol. Early humans looked to the Nile for sustenance, the desert for silence, and the stars for guidance. Thoth taught them to see these not as mere features of the land, but as living lessons. The Nile's flood was collapse and renewal. The desert's silence was preservation, and the stars' alignment was humility. By interpreting these rhythms, Thoth gave humanity a framework to live in balance with the cosmos. He became the scribe of memory, recording cycles, marking floods, and aligning temples with constellations. He taught priests to honor silence, scribes to preserve truth, and farmers to trust rhythm. His role was not only spiritual, but practical, ensuring that wisdom guided daily life, from planting crops to building temples. Thoth also disguised truths in myth. Gods and animals became carriers of wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, tempered by humility. These symbols allowed wisdom to survive collapse, hidden in stories that could be retold across generations. Early humans did not always understand the depth of these myths, but they carried fragments of truth nonetheless. His role was patient. He did not force humanity to remember, but waited for them to rediscover. He knew that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they dismiss wisdom. Pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. By guiding early humans, Thoth ensured that fragments of truth would endure, waiting for seekers with humility. And so Thoth's role among early humans was not as ruler or conqueror, but as guardian and teacher. He preserved wisdom in silence, disguised it in ritual, and carried it in symbol. His presence ensured that Egypt's rebirth was not only survival, but the beginning of a civilization guided by fragments of truth. When Egypt rose as the vessel of rebirth, its rulers were not chosen merely to govern the land, These secrets were not written in scrolls or spoken in words, but disguised in rituals, symbols, and silence. They were gifts of memory, passed carefully to ensure that Egypt's rulers would preserve balance rather than succumb to pride. The secrets taught pharaohs that their power was not eternal, but rhythmic. The Nile's flood reminded them that collapse and renewal are inseparable. The desert's silence taught them that wisdom endures only when preserved in stillness. The stars above whispered humility, guiding them to align temples with constellations and remember their place in the cosmos. Pharaohs were guardians of these truths, not owners of them. Coronations echoed cosmic rhythms, funerary rites disguised lessons of renewal, and temple ceremonies preserved fragments of wisdom. Pharaohs learned that their role was not to dominate, but to sustain. They were bridges between humanity and the cosmos, guardians of silence and keepers of balance. Symbols carried the secrets further. The ibis reminded pharaohs of clarity, the serpent of renewal, the lion of strength, tempered by humility. These animals were not mere emblems, but vessels of wisdom. Pharaohs wore them as crowns, carved them into temples, and carried them in rituals, ensuring that fragments of truth would endure across generations. Yet the secrets were fragile. Thoth knew that pride blinds, silence is lost, and collapse follows. Even when rulers forgot, the rituals remained. Even when pride grew, the symbols endured. Even when collapse returned, the secrets waited patiently for rediscovery. And so, the pharaohs became more than kings. They were guardians of fragments, keepers of silence, vessels of wisdom. The secrets passed to them were not promises of eternity, but reminders of rhythm. Through them, Egypt carried the essence of the first civilization, disguised in ritual, preserved in silence, and waiting patiently for humanity to listen once more. With Egypt established as the vessel of rebirth, a new age began, the age of memory made permanent. The wisdom Thoth carried from the ruins of the first civilization was no longer preserved only in silence, ritual, or symbol. It was now carved into stone, written on papyrus, and aligned with the stars. This was the beginning of recorded history, the moment when humanity's memory became visible and enduring. The Nile's rhythm guided the first calendars. Priests measured its floods, scribes marked its cycles, and temples aligned with its flow. What had once been oral tradition became inscription. The rising and retreating waters were no longer just lived experience, but recorded truth, preserved for generations to come. Temples became libraries of stone. Walls carried myths disguised as wisdom. Hieroglyphs encoded fragments of truth, and rituals were preserved in writing. What had once been silence became symbol. What had once been memory became inscription. The first records were not mere lists, but echoes of cosmic rhythm, reminders of balance, and whispers of humility. Thoth's influence was clear. As the eternal scribe, he taught humanity that writing was not only communication, but preservation. He ensured that wisdom would not vanish with collapse, but endure in records. Even when pride returned, inscriptions would remain, waiting patiently for rediscovery. The beginning of recorded history was not simply the invention of writing. It was the transformation of wisdom into permanence. Calendars preserved cycles, myths disguised truths, rituals carried echoes, and symbols encoded memory. Humanity had entered a new age, one where silence was carved into stone. Humility was written in symbol, and balance was preserved in record. And so, Egypt became not only the land of rebirth, but the cradle of recorded history. Its scribes carried fragments of wisdom across time. Its temples preserved truths in stone, and its rituals echoed cosmic rhythms. The beginning of recorded history was the beginning of humanity's memory made eternal, ensuring that fragments of truth would endure across ages. The tale of the first civilization, its collapse, and the rebirth of wisdom in Egypt is not only memory, it is warning. The story is not simply about Egypt's rise, but about the dangers that return whenever wisdom is dismissed. The warning is clear. Civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they forget balance. Pride blinds rulers, noise drowns silence, and spectacle replaces wisdom. When humility is lost, collapse follows. The first civilization fell because it believed itself eternal. Egypt endured because it remembered rhythm, silence, and humility. The story whispers that no civilization is invincible, and that forgetting wisdom is the beginning of ruin. Symbols carry the warning. Spirals remind us of cycles, circles of balance, stars of humility. Animals disguise truths, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength tempered by humility. These are not decorations, but fragments of warning, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover their meaning. The temples of Egypt preserved the warning in stone. Their alignments with stars whispered humility. Their rituals echoed silence. Their myths disguised truths. Even when pride returned, the warning endured, carved into walls, hidden in rituals, waiting for seekers with patience. The story warns that progress without balance is vanity. Knowledge without wisdom is noise, and power without humility is collapse. It reminds humanity that history begins too late when wisdom is ignored, and that collapse is not punishment but consequence. And so, the warning hidden in this story is not about Egypt alone, but about humanity itself. Civilizations rise and fall, but wisdom endures in fragments. The choice is always the same: to listen to silence, to honor humility, to preserve balance, or to dismiss them and fall once more. The first civilization did not vanish entirely when its monuments crumbled and its rituals faded. Its legacy was not in stone or armies, but in truths disguised in symbols, myths, and rituals, truths that whispered across ages, waiting for humanity to listen. The legacy taught that civilizations rise and fall, not because they lack knowledge, but because they forget humility. Pride blinds rulers, noise drowns silence, and spectacle replaces wisdom. Yet even in collapse, fragments survive. Spirals remind us of cycles, circles of balance, stars of humility. Animals carry wisdom, the ibis for clarity, the serpent for renewal, the lion for strength, tempered by humility. These fragments are the inheritance of humanity, the legacy of the first civilization. Egypt became the vessel of this legacy. Its Nile carried cycles, its desert preserved silence, and its stars whispered humility. Temples aligned with constellations, rituals echoed cosmic rhythms, and myths disguised truths. Through Egypt, the legacy of the first civilization was preserved, ensuring that even when pride returned, fragments of wisdom would endure. The legacy is not a promise of eternity, but a reminder of rhythm. It teaches that silence preserves, humility sustains, and pride destroys. It warns that progress without balance is vanity, Knowledge without wisdom is noise, and civilizations collapse when they forget these lessons. The first civilization fell, but its legacy became the seed of rebirth, planted in Egypt, carried across time, waiting patiently for rediscovery. And so, the story of the first civilization is not only memory, but guidance. The fragments endure, waiting for humanity to choose balance once more. And now, as the story rests in silence, let its legacy drift into your thoughts like the Nile's gentle rhythm. The temples fade into shadow, the stars whisper softly above, and the desert holds its patient stillness. The wisdom of ages waits quietly, preserved in silence, disguised in ritual, carried in symbol. Close your eyes, let the fragments settle, and remember, civilizations rise and fall, but truth endures. Sleep now, with the stars as scribes and silence as guardian. Good night.